The room was dim, wrapped in the haze of cigarette smoke, and the quiet hum of a piano filled the air. Then came her voice, Sarah Vaughan, rich, flawless, and unlike anything the world had ever heard. It wasn't just sound. It was emotion turned into music. Some said her voice could melt the hardest hearts. Others believed it could stop time itself. But how does a woman with a voice that perfect, that eternal, end up fading from the spotlight she once commanded? What happens when the world forgets the sound that once defined an era? This is the story of Sarah Vaughan, the Divine One, her rise, her silence, and the legacy that still lingers in every note she left behind. Let's get into her story right now. Grab yourself a warm drink, sit back, and let's start this journey together. If you love stories that give legends their flowers, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Star's underrated stories. She came from a quiet street in Newark, New Jersey, the kind of place where Sunday mornings were filled with hymns and the smell of fresh bread. Sarah Lois Vaughan was born on the 27th of March, 1924, in a small wooden house on Brunswick Street. Her father, Asbury Jake Vaughan, was a carpenter who played guitar and piano. Her mother, Ada, sang in the church choir. Together, they filled that little house with music long before Sarah's voice ever did. In those early days, the church was her world. At 7, she began playing piano, her small hands barely reaching the keys, but her ear already sharp. The rhythms of gospel and the harmony of voices shaped her first understanding of what sound could mean. In church, she learned discipline, how to breathe, how to listen, and how to blend with others before learning how to stand apart. But outside those church walls, the city had another kind of rhythm. Newark in the 1930 decade was alive with jazz, the heartbeat of an America finding itself between hard times and hope. Local bands played at skating rinks and corner clubs, and young Sarah would sneak out, just to listen. She'd press her ear against the wall, memorizing every note. Those sounds forbidden, daring became her education. By her teenage years, the piano was no longer enough. She wanted to sing what she felt. At the Piccadilly Club and later near Newark Airport, she began performing late into the night. Sometimes she'd accompany herself on piano. Other times, she'd just close her eyes and let the voice take over. People would stop mid-conversation, surprised that so big a sound could come from such a small girl. It was raw, untrained, but it had that rare thing truth. She went to East Side High, then transferred to Newark Arts High School, where her nights as a performer began to overshadow her days as a student. The world outside was calling louder than any classroom could, so she left school before graduation, a choice that scandalized her family, but one that defined her. Music, she once said later, was the only thing that ever felt right. Her father worried, her mother prayed, but Sarah was already chasing something bigger, not fame, not money, just the freedom to sing her own way. In 1942, fate knocked on the door of the Apollo Theater in Harlem. Sarah entered an amateur night competition, the same stage that had once introduced Billie Holiday to the world. The theater lights were blinding, and her knees trembled as she stood in front of that crowd. But then, she sang. The sound that filled that hall silenced everyone. It wasn't polished yet, but it was unforgettable. When the final note faded, the audience rose to its feet. Sarah had won. The prize was small, $50, but the door it opened would change everything. Among the people listening that night was Billy Eckstine, then singing with Earl Hines's big band. He remembered her voice. A few weeks later, she received a call. At Orphan, Sarah Vaughan left Newark behind. She joined the Earl Hines big band not as a star, but as a pianist, because the musicians' union didn't allow him to hire another singer. But even then, her voice couldn't be hidden for long. Night after night, she sang during rehearsals, and soon the whole band began to turn their heads. They were the young rebels of jazz, Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Benny Green, men who were changing music forever. And in the middle of it all was Sarah, still just a girl from Newark, holding her own among legends. The road wasn't easy. She traveled across the country, performing in smoke-filled halls, sleeping on buses, living on cheap food and big dreams. But she never complained. She was learning not just how to sing, but how to survive. When the war years made touring uncertain and recording strikes kept many voices off the air, Sarah stayed steady. She watched, she listened, she absorbed. You could hear the future in that band, one musician later said. And Sarah, she was part of that future. By the end of 1943, she was no longer just the girl who sang in church. She had become the voice that could silence a room, the young woman who would soon redefine what it meant to sing jazz. Before the fame, before the lights, before the name, the Divine One, there was just a girl at a piano in Newark and a dream too big for that little house on Brunswick Street. The first real stage lights Sarah Vaughan ever stood under didn't belong to her. They belonged to the Earl Hines Big Band, one of the most electrifying groups in America at the time. In early 1944, she joined them, officially hired as a pianist. But everyone in that band knew there was more to her than the keys beneath her fingers. It didn't take long for her voice to break through. During rehearsals, when the band would finish a tune, Sarah would hum the melody back, softer but cleaner, reshaping the lines the horns had just played. Dizzy Gillespie, the trumpet genius, once turned to her and said, "Girl, you've got chords in your throat." That band wasn't just another orchestra. It was the birthplace of something revolutionary bebop. Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Benny Green, and others were redefining jazz, bending harmonies, breaking rules. And there, in the middle of this musical rebellion, stood an 18-year-old from Newark who could sing like an instrument. But fate, as always, had its complications. The musicians' union strike had silenced most of the studios, so there were no recordings from this legendary lineup. What happened on stage every night lived only in memory. Still, those months were her education, her true conservatory. When the Hines Band began to split, Billy Eckstein, her friend and mentor, decided to form his own orchestra. Sarah followed him. She didn't know it then, but she was stepping into a chapter that would define her for the rest of her life. Her first studio recording came on the 5th of December, 1944. The song was "I'll Wait and Pray." The voice that came through that microphone was something no one had heard before, a mix of classical precision and gospel soul, smooth but fearless. Critics said she sang like she was painting with sound. Every syllable had color, every breath had intent. Producer Leonard Feather, one of the most respected jazz critics of the era, was mesmerized. He arranged another recording session later that month, surrounding her with a small group that included Gillespie and Georgie Auld. It was rare company for a newcomer, but Sarah fit right in. When the red light came on, she didn't hesitate. She sang with confidence, not like someone hoping to be discovered, but like someone who already knew who she was. By the end of 1945, she was ready to stand alone. She left Eckstein's band and went solo, guided by her new husband and manager, George Treadwell. He helped shape her image, elegant gowns, perfect hair, and a calm poise that hid the storm of creativity within. But it was her voice, not her look, that people remembered. Her early recordings for Continental and later Musicraft revealed a talent in full bloom. Songs like "If You Could See Me Now" and "Tenderly" showed a woman who could take a simple melody and turn it into something intimate, almost sacred. She was no longer the girl sneaking into clubs in Newark. She was Sarah Vaughan, a name people were starting to whisper with reverence. In those early years, she learned how to balance art and ambition, how to please the audience without losing herself. And as the 1940 decade drew to a close, one thing was certain. The world of jazz had found a new voice, one that would not just follow the music, but lead it. By 1947, Sarah Vaughan had already earned a quiet reputation inside the jazz world, not just as a singer, but as a force. Her voice could bend a melody without breaking it, glide through impossible notes, and make every lyric feel like it belonged to her alone. The critics began calling her sassy, a name that captured both her confidence and her defiance. The post-war years were a golden time for American music, but also a battlefield for identity. The airwaves were dominated by big bands and pop singers, yet Sarah stood somewhere in between, too sophisticated for the mainstream, too melodic for the jazz purists. That tension, that refusal to fit neatly into any box, would become the very essence of her style. In 1947, she signed with Musicraft Records, where her true transformation began. It was there she recorded "If You Could See Me Now," a haunting ballad written by Tad Dameron. The song demanded more than technique, it required vulnerability. Sarah didn't just sing it, she inhabited it. Her phrasing floated, unhurried, each line a whisper between strength and sorrow. Listeners felt as though she was confessing something private. Then came "Tenderly," It's Magic, and I Cried for You. These recordings proved she could shape a pop melody with the same elegance she brought to jazz. The voice that once filled smoky clubs was now finding its place on radios across America. She wasn't chasing trends, she was redefining them. In 1949, Columbia Records came calling, one of the biggest labels in the country. For Sarah, it was a chance to reach a wider audience. For Columbia, it was a risk her music didn't fit neatly with their commercial stars. But the first session silenced any doubt. Backed by arranger Percy Faith and later with trumpeter Miles Davis, she recorded songs that shimmered with emotional depth and orchestral beauty. Still, even in success, there was a quiet ache beneath it all. While the world adored her, Sarah often felt like she was standing on unfamiliar ground. In an era when women in jazz were expected to sing prettily and stay in their lane, she refused both. She wanted creative control over her sound, her image, her destiny. Her husband and manager, George Treadwell, encouraged that ambition. He polished her public image, dressed her in elegance, introduced her to photographers and promoters. To the world, she looked effortless. But behind the smile, Sarah was learning how heavy fame could feel. The long tours, the endless recording sessions, the subtle racism that followed her from city to city, they all took their toll. Yet, when she stepped on stage, none of it showed. Audiences didn't just hear her, they experienced her. She could begin a song with a sigh and end it with a hurricane, one moment tender, the next fearless. Her vibrato, perfectly controlled, became her signature, like light trembling on water. By 1950, Sarah Vaughan was no longer a newcomer. She had become a name spoken alongside Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday. But unlike them, she was carving a new lane, a sound that mixed the sophistication of jazz with the heart of gospel and the soul of pop. Critics called her the Divine One. It was a title that fit, but even then, she didn't see herself as divine. "I'm just trying to sing the way I feel," she once said, and that feeling, raw, pure, and timeless, would soon carry her to the highest peaks of her career. By the early 1950 decade, Sarah Vaughan was no longer the girl chasing stages, she was the stage itself. Her voice had matured into something deeper, darker, and infinitely more controlled. Every note carried weight, every breath felt intentional. People didn't just listen, they surrendered. When Mercury Records signed her in 1954, it marked the beginning of her most celebrated era. Here, she could finally balance her two worlds, the lush orchestral sound of pop and the intricate rhythms of jazz. One night she would sing before tuxedoed audiences in concert halls. The next, she'd be in a small club, eyes closed, scatting over a trio's groove. She moved between these spaces with grace, never losing the essence of who she was. Then came the session that changed everything, Sarah Vaughan with Clifford Brown in 1954. The meeting of her voice and Brown's trumpet was pure alchemy. Critics called it one of the finest jazz recordings ever made. On tracks like Lullaby of Birdland and April in Paris, her tone shimmered between strength and surrender. She didn't just keep up with the horn section, she danced with it, weaving her voice around the brass like smoke. That album did more than prove her musicianship. It cemented her as one of the few vocalists who could stand alongside instrumentalists, not beneath them. She wasn't a singer accompanied by a band, she was an equal, a collaborator. Jazz had found its queen. Audiences adored her. Television appearances, tours across Europe, sold-out performances, Sarah Vaughan had become a household name. But for her, the real victory wasn't in applause or sales. It was in freedom. For the first time, she could choose what to sing and how to sing it. The studio executives trusted her instincts, and musicians followed her lead. Behind that success, though, was the same quiet girl from Newark, still humble, still seeking. She often said she never liked listening to her own records. "I always hear what I could have done better," she once told an interviewer. Perfection was both her gift and her burden. During this decade, she recorded some of her most timeless songs, Misty, Broken-Hearted Melody, and Make Yourself Comfortable. Each performance carried an emotional precision few could match. She could glide from a whisper to a cry in a single line, her phrasing unpredictable yet always right. Critics compared her to Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday, but Sarah existed in her own space. Ella swung, Billie told stories. Sarah painted with sound colors, textures, and shades that no one else could touch. By the end of the 1950 decade, she had everything she had once dreamed of: fame, respect, and a voice the world called divine. Yet somewhere beneath that perfection, there lingered a hint of melancholy, a sense that even in her triumph, she was still searching for something only the music could give. And as the lights burned bright on stage, few realized that the same fire illuminating her success was also beginning to cast the first, faint shadows of what was to come. By the early 1960 decade, Sarah Vaughan was a household name, a living standard of excellence. Her voice seemed untouchable, rich as velvet, precise as glass, capable of turning even the simplest lyric into something transcendent. But behind the perfection, something quiet had begun to shift. The stage was still hers, but the world around her was changing fast. Rock and roll had taken over America. Radio stations that once played jazz and ballads now throbbed with guitars and backbeats. Record labels pushed for younger, louder sounds. Sarah didn't fit that picture, not because she couldn't, but because she refused to chase what didn't speak to her soul. She stayed loyal to her craft, her sound, her truth. And that loyalty, while noble, came with a cost. Her recordings during this period were elegant but less noticed. The charts that once carried her name now belonged to new stars. She still sang with the same fire, but fewer people were listening. The Divine One was becoming a title people remembered more than repeated. In her personal life, the harmony began to falter too. Her marriage to George Treadwell had ended in bitterness. Though he had helped shape her public image, their relationship had long been strained by control and betrayal. When it was over, Sarah took back her freedom and her finances, but not without scars. Yet she kept moving forward, driven by something deeper than fame. On stage, no one could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She smiled, she joked, she sang as if the world still belonged to her. The audience didn't need to know the loneliness that waited in her hotel rooms after the applause faded. The 1960 decade also brought new beginnings and new heartbreak. She married Clyde Atkins, a football player, hoping for stability, but the union was short-lived. She adopted a baby girl, Deborah, in 1961, finding in her child the warmth the industry had taken away. For a time, the little girl's laughter replaced the applause. But motherhood and music were a hard duet to balance, especially for a woman constantly on the road. Professionally, she was still extraordinary. Even as trends shifted, she delivered performances that stunned musicians and critics alike. Her command of phrasing, her control of dynamics, her effortless transitions between registers, no one could touch her. But success without spotlight can feel like silence. In 1969, she released a live album that reminded everyone what they had forgotten, that Sarah Vaughan was still a master of her art. But by then, the industry had turned its gaze elsewhere. She began to see the business for what it was, a place that celebrated you loudly, then forgot you quietly. And though she rarely complained, friends said she sometimes looked distant, as if singing to someone only she could see. The seeds of tragedy were never loud in her life, they grew in silence. Not in scandal or collapse, but in the slow ache of being unmatched, unchallenged, and perhaps a little bit unseen. And while her voice never faltered, the world that once listened with awe was starting to move on, unaware that one of its greatest treasures was already beginning to fade into memory. The 1970 decade opened with silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows applause when the crowd has already moved on. Sarah Vaughan was still performing, still singing with that impossible range and velvet tone. But the music world had changed once again. Jazz had been pushed aside by the roar of rock, the glitter of disco, and the rebellion of a new generation. For someone like Sarah, whose artistry lived in nuance and control, it was a lonely time. Record companies no longer knew what to do with a voice like hers. They wanted trends, not timelessness. She found herself between contracts, drifting from label to label, searching for the kind of creative freedom that once came easily. But if the industry was uncertain, Sarah was not. She refused to compromise her sound or chase fashion. "You can't sing truth if you're pretending to be someone else," she once said. So she kept performing smaller venues, intimate clubs, jazz festivals where the audiences came not for nostalgia, but for reverence. Offstage, her life mirrored her music, beautiful, complex, and occasionally turbulent. After years of independence, she began a relationship with her musical director, Marshall Fisher. It was passionate and chaotic, marked by moments of brilliance and moments of pain. They worked together closely, but the line between love and work blurred. By the mid-1970 decade, the relationship had fractured, leaving Sarah emotionally raw but artistically unbroken. Then came Wayman Reed, a trumpet player 16 years younger than her, a member of the Count Basie band. With him, Sarah found laughter again, a reminder of youth she thought she'd lost. They married in 1978, a brief but tender chapter that brought warmth into her later years. Reed became both her husband and her musical partner, joining her trio as bandleader and trumpeter. On stage, their connection was palpable, two souls speaking the same language, note by note. Despite personal challenges, the 1970 decade gave Sarah something unexpected: respect. The younger generation of musicians, from Herbie Hancock to George Benson, began citing her as an influence. Her phrasing, her control, her daring sense of timing, all became lessons for those reinventing jazz fusion. She wasn't just surviving an era, she was quietly shaping it. In 1977, Norman Granz, the legendary producer behind Ella Fitzgerald's finest years, invited her to record for his Pablo label. It was the kind of partnership Sarah had long awaited. No interference, no pressure, just pure music. The sessions that followed were intimate and deeply personal. You could hear her maturity, the lowered tones, the deepened phrasing, the subtle ache that comes only from living a full life. That same year, Berklee College of Music awarded her an honorary doctorate of music, a gesture that felt less like a trophy and more like an acknowledgement of something long overdue. The industry that had once overlooked her was now trying to make amends. Still, fame was never what she sought. In interviews, she spoke little of success. What mattered to her was the craft, the sound, the song, the moment when voice and emotion became one. By the end of the 1970 decade, Sarah Vaughan had weathered storms that would have silenced others. But she stood firm, with grace and pride. She wasn't the star of yesterday. She was the truth that never went out of style. The 1980 decade began quietly for Sarah Vaughan. The bright lights of her earlier years had softened, but her presence, her voice remained undimmed. She was no longer chasing record deals or radio charts. She didn't have to. By then, she had become what few artists ever achieve, a living legend. Yet legend and loneliness often walk the same road. The recording studios called less frequently, and tours became fewer. The industry had shifted toward youth and spectacle, but Sarah's artistry was never about spectacle. It was about sound, the way a single note could hold an entire life. Her last recordings for Pablo had come in 1982. After that, she rarely entered a studio again, but on stage, she was eternal. Fans who saw her in those years spoke of something spiritual, a woman whose every breath carried memory. Her range had deepened with time, her tone warmer, her phrasing slower, more deliberate. If her earlier years had been about brilliance, these were about truth. She traveled the world, Tokyo, London, Paris, singing not for fame, but for connection. Wherever she went, audiences rose to their feet. Some came to witness the voice. Others came to feel the grace of time itself. There was something almost sacred about her presence, the kind of quiet power that doesn't demand attention but commands it anyway. Behind the scenes, life was more fragile. Her marriage to Wayman Reed ended, but their bond as musicians endured until his passing in 1983. The loss shook her deeply. Those close to her said that after Reed's death, a different kind of silence settled in. She continued to perform, but there was a sadness in her phrasing, an ache that words couldn't touch. Even so, her spirit remained unbroken. Sarah laughed easily, loved her friends, and often stayed up until dawn after concerts sipping wine, telling stories, and listening to old records. To her, music was still a celebration, even when it carried pain. In 1985, she finally received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame decades after she had earned it. Standing before the crowd that day, she smiled softly, almost shyly. "I never thought it'd take this long," she said, but there was no bitterness in her voice, only gratitude. 3 years later, she was inducted into the American Jazz Hall of Fame, and though her health began to falter near the decade's end, she kept singing. Even as cancer quietly entered her life, she refused to let it silence her. Her final performances were haunting in their beauty, not because of perfection, but because of presence. When she sang, you could feel the years in her tone, the joy, the loss, the strength of someone who had lived fully and honestly. By the close of the 1980 decade, Sarah Vaughan had nothing left to prove. The applause no longer defined her. The silence did. In that stillness, her music lingered not as echo, but as memory. And though her voice would soon leave this world, it had already found its forever. When Sarah Vaughan passed away in 1990, the world didn't just lose a voice, it lost a sound that had defined the very soul of jazz. News of her death spread quietly, almost too quietly for someone who had once held entire theaters breathless. Yet for those who truly knew, her absence felt like silence falling over an entire era. Tributes poured in from around the world. Musicians, singers, critics, everyone who had ever loved the language of song spoke her name with reverence. Ella Fitzgerald called her one of the greatest there ever was. Frank Sinatra once said that Sarah had the single best vocal instrument he had ever heard. Those weren't compliments. They were acknowledgments of truth. Her influence ran deeper than style or genre. She had expanded the possibilities of what the human voice could do, bending notes, shifting tones, creating colors that instruments could only dream of. For singers who came after her, she was both teacher and map. Aretha Franklin, Diane Reeves, Anita Baker, and Whitney Houston all carried pieces of her phrasing that turned simplicity into art. Even as popular culture moved on, music schools across America continued to study her recordings. At Berklee College of Music, the same institution that had given her an honorary doctorate in 1978, her name became a verb among vocal students. To Vaughan meant to shape a note with emotion and precision, until it became more than music. Her songs, once confined to smoky clubs and vinyl grooves, found new life in digital form. Young listeners discovered Misty, Tenderly, and If You Could See Me Now not as relics, but as revelations. And every time her voice emerged from a speaker, it sounded as if time itself paused to listen. In 1985, she had finally received her long-overdue star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. 3 years later, she entered the American Jazz Hall of Fame, but her honors didn't stop there. In 2012, she was posthumously inducted into the New Jersey Hall of Fame, a symbolic homecoming to the city that had shaped her. The same Newark streets, where she once sang in church choirs, now bore murals of her face. The same community that had once watched her leave now celebrated her return. Across the Atlantic, European jazz festivals began dedicating nights in her name. Japanese audiences, who had adored her since the 1970 decade, continued to fill concert halls for tribute performances. In Paris, a critic once wrote, "Sarah Vaughan did not just sing jazz, she gave it a conscience." Time had changed the industry, but it could not change her place within it. She wasn't just part of jazz history, she was its heartbeat. For every generation that followed, Sarah Vaughan remained a reminder of what true artistry means. Not perfection, but authenticity. She never chased the world's approval. She gave it beauty instead. And though she left this earth, her voice, that miraculous, unmistakable voice, still lives in the air, in the grooves, in the quiet moments when music feels like prayer. In the years that followed her passing, the world slowly began to understand what it had truly lost. Sarah Vaughan had not only been a singer, she was a living archive of emotion, a bridge between eras, a voice that carried both the discipline of church and the freedom of jazz. Her music, once considered complex and ahead of its time, now felt timeless. In America, new generations of artists rediscovered her through reissues, documentaries, and digital playlists. Young singers listened in disbelief, wondering how a human voice could glide so effortlessly from a whisper to a roar. Vocal coaches analyzed her phrasing, her pitch control, her ability to make a single word bloom with meaning. But what no lesson could teach was her instinct, that mysterious, invisible force that made every note sound inevitable. Critics who had once overlooked her commercial potential began calling her one of the greatest interpreters in American music. Jazz historians started placing her not beside others, but above the category entirely. She wasn't just one of the best female vocalists, she was one of the greatest musicians, period. Outside the United States, her influence deepened. In Japan, She was regarded with near religious devotion. Her albums sold steadily, long after her death, and jazz clubs in Tokyo still dedicate entire nights to her memory. In London and Paris, tributes to the Divine One became annual events, drawing both older fans who once saw her live and younger ones who had only heard her through vinyl crackle and memory. For African-American artists, Sarah Vaughan's legacy carried even greater weight. She had fought quietly but fiercely against the constraints of her time, a black woman commanding respect, not through protest, but through mastery. In a world that often demanded simplicity from its black entertainers, she dared to be intricate, sophisticated, untamed. Her existence alone was a statement of power. When scholars later examined her place in history, they found something remarkable. Sarah Vaughan's career traced the entire arc of modern American music. She began with gospel, embraced jazz, touched pop, brushed classical, and ended as a figure who transcended them all. She belonged everywhere and nowhere at once, a testament to her independence of spirit. Her story also resonated with those who feared being forgotten. Listeners who had grown older with her found comfort in the thought that even legends could fade quietly and still remain eternal. In that way, Sarah's journey became more than music. It became a reflection of life itself. Brilliance, struggle, reinvention, and peace. Over time, tributes to her grew more personal. Musicians didn't just honor her sound, they honored her courage. Singers didn't just study her phrasing, they tried to live her truth that artistry isn't about fame, but about faith in what you create. Today, when her records play, they don't sound old. They sound alive, as if she's still in some corner of a dimly lit room, singing softly to whoever's willing to listen. Sarah Vaughan may have left the stage long ago, but she never left the song. The lights are dim again, the smoke has cleared, and the room is quiet just as it was when we first began. Somewhere in the dark, a single note rises and fades, and for a fleeting second, it feels as if Sarah Vaughan is still here. She lived her life the way she sang, with grace, courage, and truth. She never chased trends or fame. She chased honesty. Her voice wasn't just sound, it was the sound of time passing the sound of love, loss, faith, and everything that made us human. When Sarah sang, you didn't hear a song, you felt a story. You felt a lifetime wrapped inside a melody. And maybe that's why, even now, decades after she's gone, her voice still lingers like perfume in the air, familiar, comforting, unforgettable. The Divine One taught us that success isn't measured by how long the spotlight shines, but by what remains when it fades. She showed us that greatness doesn't need noise, it needs soul. There's something hauntingly beautiful about the way her story ends. The world moved on, but her music never did. It still finds its way into hearts that never knew her, into nights that feel too quiet, into dreams that need reminding that real art never dies. For those who grew up hearing her on vinyl, she's a memory that never aged. For those discovering her today, she's a revelation. Sarah Vaughan's gift was eternal because it was never about perfection, it was about truth, and truth never goes out of style. So maybe the next time you hear her voice in an old record store, a movie soundtrack, or a quiet cafe, pause for a moment. Remember the woman behind that sound. Remember the girl from Newark who dared to dream bigger than the world allowed. Because Sarah Vaughan wasn't just a singer. She was a reminder that even when the world forgets, the music remembers. Do you think Hollywood ever gave her the respect she truly deserved? If this story touched you, leave a message for Sarah below. Tell us the first song of hers you ever heard, or the one that still makes you stop and listen. And if you believe that some legends deserve their flowers, hit subscribe and help us keep their light alive here on Stars Underrated, where the world forgot, but we remember.